attachment to the cloud. You get put on the computer, you have to get it afterwards.
I'm gonna share it with myself on Google Drive, which good thing we have half an hour sitting here doing nothing after this seminar. Okay, so everything should be set up. So today we're going to talk about adjudicating. I think adjudicating is often very poorly I guess, treated in debating circuits. It's often treated as something like that is an inferior, or like, you know, what you do if you can't debate, or, you know, what you do to, you know, get points or to meet a quota for a certain tournament. And I think that's silly. Adjudicating is cool and lots of fun. And hopefully you think so too. So let's start with why is it good to know how to adjudicate? Just to like foreground this, explaining why it's a good thing. Firstly, as I said, it's just a good skill to have. It's good to be able to listen to and understand arguments critically and to make decisions about them. Becoming a good adjudicator is good for you in general. It also makes you a better debater. Not only do you know what adjudicators are looking for when they are adjudicating you, but you get to watch some super good debates that you may not otherwise have ended up in as a debater, and you can develop from that as well. Debating doesn't function without good adjudicators. So even if you're not super interested in it on its own, you need to be able to provide adjudicators to make like tournaments function. And on that note, there is a tournament on the weekend called MAC Pre-Easters. And I'm sure if you want some practice adjudicating, they would very much like to have you as an adjudicator. You can go adjudicate for the contingent. It makes up, you know, part of a quota which allows UCID teams to compete in the contingent. It's always lots of fun and people are very grateful. And the last reason is that you can financially profit from adjudicating. And I'm going to foreground this, not because it is the, you know, main reason that you should adjudicate, but just to get into the debate. How should you approach it? You should approach debates as if you are the average intelligent voter. Now, there is like a technical definition for average intelligent voter. I think it's like someone who has read the first few pages of like major world newspapers or something like that. But for the purposes of understanding like the mindset that you should be in, there are kind of three aspects to consider. Firstly, you have some good degree of general knowledge. For example, you may understand how something like elections work in, you know, a few countries like Australia, the US, the UK. So you have like an understanding of the world. You're not totally clueless, but you don't have any specialized knowledge. You don't have any areas where you know an awful lot about it more than the average person would. You don't have a clear political leaning, but you do have a basic set of values. So for example, in a debate about you know, police brutality, you shouldn't go into the debate believing it is inherently moral to defund the police or to abolish the police, because that is like a very clear political leaning, but you can go into the debate, in fact should, believing that it is bad if people are dying, right? So you don't have to abandon morality in general, but you shouldn't have any clear political leaning. And lastly, you have the capacity to understand complex arguments, but not the capacity to fill in logical gaps left by teams. So if a team, if a team makes an argument that is quite complex but well explained, you are allowed to believe it and to understand it and credit it. You shouldn't be like, oh, the average person wouldn't understand this. But if they're leaving gaps, you shouldn't be filling in the legwork that the team should have done because you believe that the average person would be able to fill in those gaps, unless it is like you should be letting them do the legwork. This is more about the level of bias that you should exhibit. The impact of this is twofold. Firstly, you shouldn't bring your own ideologies or spec knowledge or preconceptions about the topic into the debate. So I know it is tempting. Don't Google a topic or talk about it too much before the debate so that you don't like prejudice what arguments you expect to see or think are good. But it also means that you should hold debaters to a reasonable standard of proof for their arguments. They can't just rely on like debaterisms or shortcuts that debaters often rely on. I think there is a tendency that some debaters have to make claims or to refer to things like, you know, as per the state power principle and not explain it, or to say things like, you know, this is bad because it harms minorities and not explain why we should care about minorities over the majority. Make sure that they are doing the legwork and not just relying on things that you may have seen in other debates, because obviously that's not fulfilling their burden. So you are, you know, walking into the debate room, you are the average intelligent voter who is going to be adjudicating a debate. There's the chair. They are the person who is in charge of the debate. They are responsible for admin things like doing introductions and a pronoun round, which is obviously really important, and also making sure that people are listening to said pronoun round. They must do things like keep order. You can say just order and then call out what the infraction is, but making sure that people aren't speaking too loudly at the bench, for example, making sure that speakers are getting up to do their speech in a timely manner. They must time keep, so indicating intervals in the speech. In Easters, that's like 1 clap or 1 bell at 6 minutes, 2 at 8, continuous at 8:15. So that's what the chair's set of responsibilities. Sometimes you can also have panelists. So that's when you have more than one person. You have one chair and a few panelists. A panelist gets a vote in the end decision. They get to contribute to that deliberation. They may have to do an OA, which I'm flagging now, because even though you're not the chair who's running the debate, that doesn't mean that you should be doing any less work as an adjudicator. And I'll explain the context where you may have to do an OA or an oral adjudication later. And you can most definitely give feedback to speakers on the team. So if you are a debater, you can approach panelists for feedback. If you are a panelist, you can offer to give it, and you should be taking notes of feedback. The last type of adjudicator is a trainee, which is essentially like a trial run as a panelist. You don't get a vote in the ultimate decision, but you should be doing everything that the panelist would do. It's not an excuse to just be able to sit there and watch. You should be doing it as if you are a panelist, and then hopefully you learn and improve and are able to not become a trainee later, right? So those are the people who are in the debate. What should you be doing as an adjudicator in a debate? The first thing is take notes. Oh my God, you should be taking notes. It is not only disrespectful to be sitting there during someone's speech and just not taking any note of what they are saying, but it's also just really silly because if you're relying on your own memory, that is very difficult to do for one speech, let alone 6 speeches worth of what is being covered in the debate. But it is also just it means that you are more likely to be susceptible to being tricked by debaters. So why is it important that you take notes? Firstly, it is good that you just actually know what's happening in the debate. It's good that you know what ideas are brought up where, what examples are given, so that you are able to look back over the debate afterwards and actually critically evaluate each team's contribution. It's also good because debaters can be really sneaky and do things like case shift. So change the version of the case that they are presenting to you, or they can contradict themselves and hope that you don't notice, or they can say oh, check your notes, we said this. And if you don't have those notes, you might be persuaded to believe something that's not true. So you should be taking notes not only to remember what is being said, but to remember exactly the manner in which it is said to make sure the debaters can't trick you rhetorically. And lastly, it's important because you, again, may have to give an OA regardless of what, whether you are a chair or a panelist. So there should be no difference in the level of detail of notes that you would take down if you were a panelist than if you were a chair. You should be taking as comprehensive notes as you need. What should you be taking down as notes? Firstly, of just records of what is being said at a level of detail you'll understand when you reread it. Just a broad kind of title or heading is probably not super helpful. Put the level of detail in that you need to be able to recap that argument. I would note that when debating was online, and it kind of is still online in some cases, if a speaker drops out, you have to repeat to them the last thing that you heard them say in sufficient detail that they will remember it. If your notes aren't detailed enough for you to be able to do that, they are not detailed enough in general. You should be able to recite exactly what a speaker has just said. You don't have to take it down word for word, but enough of a gist of their argument to be able to do that. You can take down commentary on the way that points are being made. So if they make a point and they don't explain it or they assert it, you could make a note next to it saying something like underexplained to help you remember that they did make this point, but there was something about it that they didn't particularly buy. And lastly, you should be taking down feedback for debaters. Perhaps their structure is a bit confusing. Perhaps you really like the examples that they're using. This feedback is important for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's good to be able to justify to debaters and also for your own reasons why you did or did not like their speech or buy the claims that they were making. So making those comments that they about things they could have done differently is important. But also everyone needs feedback, no matter how experienced they are. Even if you think that the person who is giving the speech is much more experienced than you are, they still should be hearing what you have to say. They should be able to make an argument that you can understand. That feedback is super important. I'll also note that for those of you who are trialing, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the trial is you're going to have to give a randomly allocated speaker feedback. Yeah, so you won't know before you go into the trial, you'll watch the debate, and then you'll get to a point where it'll say, write up some feedback for first negative or whatever. You don't get to choose which speaker it is. So you should be taking down feedback for all speakers in the debate. Obviously not just in a trial setting, but it is something that is good to practice doing, even if you think that they, are doing a speech that is like better than that you would be able to do, it's still worth giving feedback. The other thing that you should be doing in debates is timing. Even if you're not a chair, obviously the chair has to time and clap so that the speaker knows where they are, but note sometimes the chair forgets to, or their timer might not work. It is good to have a backup, but it's also important that you know where points are coming up in their speeches, because that's quite indicative of how much weight they're being given in the debate, right? In that if someone spends 6 minutes on one point and 1 minute on another point, that's not only useful for you tracking how much they care about that second argument, but it's also good for feedback. You can say like, hey, this second point sounded really interesting, but you gave it 1 minute. It's probably good that you allocate your time a bit more evenly. So you should definitely be timing, even if you don't have to be the one clapping or, if your app's not dinging or whatever. So this is what you should be doing in the debate. The next thing then is how to come to a decision. And I think this is the most important thing, or one of the most important parts of being an adjudicator. So even if you're not, even if you were familiar with all of that stuff, I'd encourage you to listen quite closely to this. The first thing to note is that there is no such thing as an instant, actually, sorry, before I get into this, you can ask questions at any time. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions so far? Okay, cool. Hopefully all of that's pretty straightforward. The first thing to note about coming to a decision is that there is no such thing as an instant loss or an instant win. There is no, I think that's pretty straightforward. Obviously evaluate the debate and everything that's presented. You can't make someone lose because they failed to do something or automatically grant them the win because they did something in particular. How then do you come to a decision in the absence of instant losses or wins? You have to firstly consider the substantive contribution made by each team. That looks like asking yourself, okay, what claims have each team made? Have they proven these claims? And I'll explain what proving is now. So have they given reasons for making the claims that they have? Have they given mechanisms as to why those claims are likely to be true? Are those reasons or mechanisms reasonable? Do they make sense? Do they stand up to the level of scrutiny that the average intelligent voter would be able to provide? If they don't, you can say that's probably not a particularly strong reason. They probably haven't proven that claim particularly well. Did the other team challenge or refute those reasons? And if so, was that challenge to those reasons more believable than the initial claim? If they provide a reason which seems solid, but then that reason is quite easily rebutted by the opposing team, that they probably didn't prove their argument particularly well, if that's the extent of proving that they attempt to do. So it's also, though, unlikely that debaters will be able to prove that the claim is 100% true in every case, because that is just a very difficult thing to prove in an 8-minute speech. So ask yourself, have they proven that this claim is likely to be true most of the time for most people in most places? Because you shouldn't discredit an argument because you can think of one example where their logic might not stand. But if they have proven that in the majority of circumstances their argument is true, then you can say that yep, that argument was correct. That argument was proven sufficiently. And the next thing to note then is this idea of proving something to sufficiency, which is to say, even if you're not sure that their version of the world is the only possible one, was it likely enough to be the case that you can credit the arguments they've made which have been premised upon this claim? I think that the idea of crediting arguments which are premised upon claims, an example of this could be if you're watching a debate which is say, that we should ban cigarettes, and the affirmative team does an excellent job of proving to you that cigarettes are dangerous, and they prove, they prove in the majority of cases they are dangerous, and that is a bad thing. But they don't spend much time proving that the government has an obligation to ban dangerous things. You have to ask yourself, did they prove that in, enough cases, that in a reasonable enough amount of cases, that we should ban things which are dangerous? And if you think that they have proven that to a sufficient degree, then you can credit all of that work about, cigarettes being dangerous and therefore they should be banned. But if they haven't done that, if they haven't proven we should actually ban things which are dangerous, then all of that persuasive material that they have about cigarettes being dangerous can't be credited. Or like you can acknowledge it, but you can say that it didn't have any persuasive value because they didn't prove that initial claim to sufficiency. Hopefully that makes sense. Next, you want to compare the claims about about specific things made by both teams, asking yourself which team's claim stands up better to scrutiny, which is true in more cases, right? They might both be making very reasonable claims about a certain stakeholder, and you have to ask yourself which one is more likely, which one has been better proven, which stands up better to scrutiny. So considering all of this, the substantive contributions that both teams have made and the degree to which they were proven / subtracted by the opposition's rebuttal, what is standing at the end of the debate? So that metaphor of like what is left standing is basically like, if you assume that rebutting something sufficiently takes it away, what is left at the end of the debate for both teams? And also it's worth acknowledging on this idea of substantive contributions. Has each team met their burden? By burden, I mean, like, obviously the topic outlines something that each side has to do. And it is very tempting to minimize the amount of effort that your team has to put in by setting yourself a much easier burden. So in the example of banning cigarettes, if the negative team says something like, oh, it would be a waste of resources because you'd have to like police, I don't know, cigarette banning or something, and the affirmative team says like, oh, we just have to ban them, we don't have to prevent people from smoking them, that would not be meeting their burden, because obviously a part of that debate is that would be squirreling or making the debate too easy for them to win. So make sure that you're considering not only what is standing at the end of the debate that is left on each side of the room, but also whether that sufficiently meets the burden that the topic outlines for each respective team. Have they gone out of their way to make things a bit too easy for them / too difficult for their opposition to win? Or is this a reasonable and good faith attempt at engaging with what the topic demands of them? Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah?
What should you do if you're adjudicating if someone commits not egregious equity violation? Like they just spend 3 minutes personally attacking someone else.
Okay, so you should, firstly, I know this sounds bizarre, that does not automatically lose someone the debate, even though it is very, very tempting to not award a win to somebody who has just done something egregious. It is not your place as an adjudicator to kind of be the arm of justice in this case. What you should do is at the end of their speech, remind the room that it is inappropriate to use slurs or whatever, that they've done, which is a breach of equity violations, of equity, sorry. You should contact the equity team and let them know what's happened. If you think that it was particularly upsetting for anyone in the room, you can if it was directed at someone, like if Sam were to stand up and deliver an 8-minute speech, being making fun of me, an adjudicator could let me go outside and have some water or whatever. But you should, obviously if what they're doing is egregiously offensive, it's highly likely it's just not persuasive. So you wouldn't count it as persuasive. If they make a mistake, like misgendering someone or using a word that is outdated or something, that may not, that shouldn't affect the persuasiveness of their speech. So it's something that should be dealt with outside of the debate. Does that, yeah, is there anything else you would recommend? Obviously don't use slurs, not the fact that it can't lose you the debate doesn't mean that you should just use them. But that is something that equity should be dealing with. You should just do your best to keep the debate in order to make sure everything is okay, but it doesn't actually impact the outcome of the debate. Okay, cool. So now we know what's standing at the end of the debate. We know whether teams have met their burden or not. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah?
To get up and give a speech as an adjudicator, you just have to be like, and the next speaker, what do you do to get them to?
Yeah, so I know that this is the case for Worlds. I'm not sure if it's the case for other, so in some circuits, there is a mandatory, once the adjudicator has called for you to begin, you have to do so within a minute. I don't think it's a case for Easters. Although I think you can just encourage, you can say, please stand up and begin your speech. If there is a genuine reason, if, for example, there's a medical reason that they can't stand up, then that's use your discretion. I think you can permit that. But if they are just genuinely just taking their time, I would say just tell them to hurry up. I don't know if can you threaten more than that? Or do you just have to say, okay, please don't do that. It's really annoying. Adjudicators will be upset at you. You can probably ask equity to make an announcement afterwards to encourage people to stand up on time, because obviously it's quite rude if you are taking up a lot of time. But yes, I would just remind them to stand up. Okay, cool. All right, so at the end of the debate, you know what stands, you know whether teams have met their burden or not, in terms of like what they need to prove. How then do you weigh what's remaining? The next question you ask yourself is which claims that have been made are more important, like which team's claims are more important. The first thing that you should consider is the metrics introduced and used within the debate. So what do both teams tell you are the most important outcomes? If in the debate, both teams are particularly concerned with which side has better outcomes for privacy, for example, that is a very relevant metric that you should consider when judging the debate. And by the same token, you shouldn't be kind of imposing unrelated or like metrics that weren't considered very heavily in the debate onto your adjudication. It would be unreasonable to impose something like, asking a question of which side is better for privacy if that was like just like one argument brought up. That's not like the most important claims in the debate, clearly. But beyond what teams in the debate thought were important, ask yourself which team's claims were more likely. Which team has proven that the impacts they point to are more certain than the other's teams. Obviously, arguments which have successfully been proven to be more likely to eventuate in like a harm are more important than a very speculative harm. So you want to give more credit and reward claims which have been proven to be more likely. Ask yourself which claims have a more meaningful impact on people, right? A benefit which, I don't know, makes someone kind of happy is less important than a benefit which meaningfully changes their life, right? For example, like, I don't know, getting them better access to healthcare or something is probably a more important benefit than just like appeasing people. So weighing claims' importance based on the meaningful impact they have on people. Then asking which claims impact the most people. Maybe one side claims a benefit for a small group, the other side claims a benefit for a big group. But maybe the team defending the small group says that these people are actually much more vulnerable, and we have an obligation to care for people who are much more vulnerable, and they explain that in great detail. Have either team proven who is most important in the debate? And, do they prove that they impact them sufficiently? Note that all of these things, if you've done debating, are how you impact points in the first place. This is why. This is how the adjudicator decides the debate. It's not which team proves things better. It's which team proves more impactful things better. So it is really important that you as an adjudicator use that framework of like which claims that are left standing are more important to decide the outcome of the debate. Also ask yourself though, is there a principled or moral basis to either case? Have, either team proven that that principle is important? And have they proven that we should care about that principle enough for it to justify conforming to their world, even if it requires a trade-off? If a team successfully proves, if they follow Dan's seminar from last week and successfully proves that, a certain principle is worth considering, even if it requires making a trade-off, a practical trade-off, then that is something that should factor into the adjudication as well. Anything else? Oh yeah, so the last thing to note here is that any of these factors can be more or less important in a given debate. So make sure that you use your own judgment as well as the value placed on each factor listed above in the debate itself to determine which things are the most important. And so the team that has the most claims with the greatest impact or the most important impact at the end of the debate should be the one that wins. Okay, any questions about that? All right. So other questions to ask yourself when you are adjudicating. What else was brought up in the debate that I didn't think was important? And why am I not giving it that much weight? Maybe they made an argument which they didn't spend much time on that I didn't think was super important. So I can note like, okay, this was underexplained. Or maybe they brought something up that was well explained, but you just didn't see how it was relevant to the central clash of the debate. Or maybe you thought the stakeholders they were describing weren't particularly sympathetic. So if you are going to disregard something in the outcome of a debate, which is fine, make sure you have a reason for doing so, which will come up later when you, share your result, but just make sure anything you're discounting, there is a reason for that. Next, ask yourself, when was material brought up in the debate? Note that third speakers can't bring up new substantive. they can have some novel responses, but the novel parts must be additional mechanisms or responses to things brought up in the speaker prior. So you can note that a response given, at third and say that it was too novel to concretely count, but illustrates that the argument they're responding to is flawed. In other words, you can count material brought up by third speaker as responsive material, but not as substantive material. So in this example, which is, I guess, kind of unrealistic, but it's the best way I could think of illustrating it. Again, with that like smoker debate, let's say that the affirmative team is kind of asserting that if we ban cigarettes, no one will have access to them ever, and so we can claim all these benefits of stopping people from smoking. Maybe second negative says something like, oh, you've just asserted that people won't have access to them. Obviously they will, but then they don't explain it further. Then we hear at third neg, actually, it is quite likely that they will have access to, people still have access to cigarettes because nicotine is highly addictive. There is a great demand for it, and therefore people will continue to create it on a black market in the same way that other people create illicit drugs under the status quo. That does seem like a very reasonable argument. If it was brought up at first negative, you could claim that as like the counterfactual that the negative team were defending. You can't, because it's brought up at third, you can't use that as the alternative world that the negative is pointing to, but you can use that to say the affirmative argument was clearly flawed because it was just asserted. They do give a reason, which is late, but it illustrates that the argument wasn't perfect in the first place. Hopefully that makes sense. It can count responsively, but not substantively. Next, ask yourself, were there any contradictions or discrepancies that leave holes in their case? Perhaps they prove something, a really good point, really well, but in the next speaker, they prove an argument that directly contradicts the logic of that first point, which means that it is obviously, you can't credit both of them at the same time. That's something that's worth considering. Ask then, are you fairly crediting material? Are you being overly punitive to speakers who may speak less confidently? Maybe they have an accent or a speech impediment. Oh, sorry, all of us have accents. Maybe they have an accent that you're not familiar with. Maybe they use a different style to what you're used to. Or perhaps on the inverse, am I overly crediting someone because I know that they're a good debater and I think they know what they're talking about? Maybe I didn't follow that argument that they made at all, but I just saw them give a seminar, which means that they must know what they're talking about. So I'll just assume that I'm dumb and just credit their material fully. Don't do that. Like, you should be able to understand what they're saying. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So I would assess, firstly, it could be true that one of them is very well proven and the other one is just not. And if there was one that was not well proven, I would buy the first one instead of the other one. Note in your decision that there was a contradiction. But if they go to lengths to prove them both, you can say that they defeat their own argument by proving that their initial claim is not true in every case, for example. So if it is like a minor thing, like their first point is about how faced with a certain policy, all teachers, for example, are going to act in this way. And then the next point is about how teachers who act in another way will also be bad. You can say note that it was clear that it wasn't true that all teachers would act this way, but, perhaps most teachers would, because they didn't explain why in that second instance, it was likely to be a big group of people. Or you can credit the second argument because that seems more likely. Do note when there are contradictions, because sometimes they do just completely delete arguments that have been made by prior speakers. But in the event that it's not completely mutually exclusive, I would just say that it detracts from how convincing the more convincing argument is if they point to a flaw themselves. Does that make sense? Does any other pro have any thoughts on that?
The official recommendation, unless the second one is so much more well explained.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, defer to the first one made unless the second one is so much better proven. All right, sorry, maybe I should have read the judging manual before I claim to be an authority on the subject. Cool, okay. So yeah, make sure you are fairly crediting material. Oh yes, sorry, is that a question? Yeah, of course. So I'm going to explain soon how to do speaker points, which is how you credit specific speakers' contributions in the debate. In terms of crediting the material that they're bringing up, if you actually can't hear them, or you actually can't understand them perhaps because they're mumbling or there's just like a significant barrier to your understanding. Don't try to fill in gaps for them. Write down what you can hear and interpret it charitably. Like, don't just write it off as like, oh, I can't hear it. Like, do your best to understand. Perhaps if they are genuinely inaudible and you think that they could speak louder, you can just be like, sorry, could you speak a bit louder? Especially if it's like online, that's an issue that is usually easily fixable. You can just say, sorry, can you move closer to the mic or whatever? And then in terms of what they raise, credit it just as much as you would credit others, but then maybe note, either in a speaker score or in feedback that there was a difficulty in you understanding them. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay. Next, make sure that you are not being biased, or sorry, ask yourself if you're being biased towards a particular speaker or argument because you like them or you like it. Is your friend on one of the teams and you kind of want them to win, / do you not like someone on one of the teams and you are very reluctant to hand them a win? Maybe there's an argument, like obviously if you like an argument because it is very well made and very clear, you're allowed to credit it fairly. But say that I, as someone who studies linguistics and really likes language, hear an argument in a debate about language, and I get really excited because I never hear arguments about language, and this makes me feel cool and valid and important. It would be bad of me to then credit that argument about language beyond what another adjudicator would credit it, right? Just because it's like a little pet argument, or maybe one that I thought of before the debate, which I thought would be cool. Don't overly credit those arguments just because you like them more than others. And lastly, in a similar note, am I entering the debate? What that means is, am I imposing my own frame, my own thoughts onto the debate? Am I stepping in and doing the work that the team should otherwise have been doing? If the answer to any of those last 3 points is yes, please stop it. It's very, there's no point having an adjudicator if they are not going to listen to what the teams are saying, because then they're just making a decision on their own as opposed to actually evaluating the debate before them. It is hard to tell whether you are entering the debate or just being an average intelligent voter. That's what you get better at over time. But just make sure you are conscious of, is this something, a claim that they actually made? Did they actually impact this point? Or am I just believing it because I want to, or because I like them, or because it's what I would have done? So you've decided the result of the debate based on all of those factors. How then do you decide speaker scores? So speaker scores are awarded from between 70 and 80. A 70 is like they pretty much just stood up and said their name and sat back down. An 80 is the best speech that you are likely to hear at any given tournament. A 75 is an average speech at the tournament that you're at, usually. Sometimes, or with Easters last year, they said a 75 was an average at Australs, which will be clarified. Yes, Oscar? Okay, for the time being, right, okay. So you will get, as in this next point, there will be a speaker scale that is distributed for any given major tournament. Access that and use it. You should be basing it on what the tournament is saying you should be using. But as a good rule of thumb, a 75 is the average speech you would expect at a given tournament. If it is a novice tournament, that 75 is probably a bit more generous than a tournament, which is like, world's level. So a 75 is good, right? Like if it's an average speech, it's like a very, it's a sufficient speech. It does what it has to in the debate. And then above that is when you see especially good. So use the whole range. Don't be afraid of doing that, but you should be having, you should have the speaker scale, which is it'll say 70 to 71, or it'll say 70 and then 71 to 73, I think, 74 to 75. And it'll tell you a description of the speech, and just make sure you are referring to that when you're making, when you're deciding speaks. Will they be provided that for Adj trials? A speaker scale? Okay, so you will get one of them for Adj trials, either to refer to during the debate or to just look at beforehand so you know what to do. So speaker scores have to add up to indicate the result of the debate. So make sure that you choose the result and the margin first and then decide speaks, which means that you shouldn't be saying well, all of the people in the negative team spoke really well, so I'm going to give them all 78s, and then I'm going to add that up, and actually their total comes up above the affirmative team, so they win. That's not how you decide the debate. That was nowhere in what I just explained the process of deciding the debate should be. So you should choose the result first, and the margin, which is like, was it especially close, perhaps like a 1 or 2 point margin, or was it very, very obvious, so a larger margin? And then after that, you should decide speaker scores. So you don't actually have to come up with a concrete number at the end of the debate before the deliberation. But what you should do is make a note of like the comparative contributions in the debate as people speak. So what I like to do is put a little range next to each speaker so I know what I'd be happy giving them. So maybe I say like 75 to 77. So it could be, like just depending on how the rest of the debate goes, that might be the range of scores I like to give. I think this is important, not only just because it makes your job easier at the end, but it also combats anti-first speaker bias, because it is very easy. It is very easy to get to the end of the debate and then think, the most robust or responsive version of their case, or the one that I remember best, came out at third. Therefore, third speakers must have done especially well. I didn't even remember what first speaker said, probably just some setup, and then like give them a lower score. Obviously, that's very silly. So it is important that you are making notes of how well people are doing as they go, not just at the end of the debate. So what do you take into account with scores? Firstly, the clarity of the argument that they are presenting. Do you understand what they are saying? Not in terms of do you understand the words that they are saying, but do you understand the argument that they are getting at? Are they contributing to the case and the debate meaningfully? Are they adding a lot, or are they doing a lot of good responsive work that would result in a higher speaker score? Are they being particularly thorough? Are there any large logical gaps, or are there things that they are missing from what they are covering? And lastly, and this is, I think, what Oscar was just alluding to potentially changing, is you can take style into account to an extent. If there was something about the way that they were speaking that prevented you from being able to understand them, just like you flagged earlier, you can take that into account in the speaker score. If it is like they were, talking especially fast and that made it difficult for you to follow, or if the words that they were using like didn't quite make sense, like you maybe weren't sure that there was something about the way that they were speaking which made it more difficult for you to follow. Don't be overly punitive, but you can just note it was more difficult for you to follow that speech than others in terms of the speaks that you were given. I think a better way to look at it is if there is someone who does a speech that is just like exceptionally good, that you think is very clear, very easy to follow, that you really like, I would say that would result, like you could be like, okay, that was probably quite a good speech, as opposed to punishing people who don't meet that same standard. Again, refer to the speaker scale that you will be given in terms of exactly what, like, it's like, I don't know if you have just graduated high school, like a marking rubric, right? Like the difference between like, adequate and nice and like excellent, right? It's that kind of grade, and it's just that sort of thing that you should be referring to. So you've got your call, you've got a range of scores for each speaker. How then do deliberations work? The first thing to note is you should have that decision and that kind of range of speaker scores for each speaker before you start talking. This is after the debate, you're given time to come to a decision. That's the deliberation. There are several types of calls that you can encounter in debates. The first is consensus, which is everyone has to agree on the call, or you take a vote at some point after discussing it for a while. So you go in with your initial call, but you can be persuaded of a different one. Or there's ballot, which is like everyone submits a ballot before you start discussing it, and the winner is just decided. There is no change there. Easters is consensus, so you do have to go through that deliberation, but note if you do Australs, that's ballot. So how is the winner decided? A few ways. The first is it's unanimous, which is you ask, at the beginning of the deliberation, who do you think won? And everyone agrees. Easy, that's straightforward. The next is consensus, which is everyone comes to the same agreement after some discussion, which is still pretty easy, pretty, workable. And I'll explain how to go through discussions in a second. The next type is it could be a split, right? Which is after some discussion, you can't come to a consensus agreement. So they take a vote at some point, and then someone votes, people vote for the team that they think should win. The types of splits are you could have the chair and the majority. So perhaps you've got 3 people on the panel and the chair and one of the panelists agree on one thing and the other panelist thinks that the other team should have won. The debate goes to the team that the majority, that the 2 people think won, and the chair gives the oral adjudication. If you have a panel with an even number of adjudicators, the debate goes to the team that the chair think won, because they have, in this context, a slightly more powerful vote called the casting vote. So say that there are 4 adjudicators and 2 think that the affirmative team won, and the other 2, including the chair, think that the neg team won, the neg team wins, the chair gives the OA. The last context is when the chair is in the minority. This is called the chair being rolled. So the two panelists agree that one team wins, the chair thinks that the other team won. If after this vote that remains the same, the debate goes to the team that the majority, the two people think won, and the chair will choose a panelist of those two to give the oral adjudication. I believe that the chair does get to choose in Easters, or potentially it just defaults to whoever is next on the tab, which is essentially like seniority. The chair will know which panelists should be giving an adjudication if that is the case. So when you announce the result, you should indicate whether it was unanimous, consensus, if it was a split, and if so, what it was. And it should also be noted in the justification of the decision where the splits occurred, which I'll explain a bit more in a second. But that's how the decisions work. How then? Oh, yes?
At Easters, is it a ballot? You can't change your vote after discussion?
No, it's consensus, but in out rounds, it's a ballot. I believe. Yeah?
Sorry, just back to the speakers.
Yeah.
With the speaks you get based on how they affect the contribution of the debate, if you're talking about an earlier speaker, and perhaps the speech, they gave a fairly good speech where the debate was that, by the end of the debate, it becomes irrelevant. The debate's moved on. That speech became less relevant. Do you count that, or do you just go based on how good the speaker was in the situation?
Like first half, it's a great speech, but one end, it's like a weak album.
Yeah.
And then it like makes them relevant.
So I guess so it depends on the reason that you think that their contribution in retrospect is less important. Maybe they do good work to set up a principle that is then just like agreed upon by the rest of the debate, in which case I would still so it's not contentious. I would still say that they contributed well to the debate, even if it wasn't something that was an issue later on. But if they, spend time setting up an argument that is just like not a very important stakeholder, and that's why it becomes irrelevant later on, then I would not credit that as highly, because even if they explain it particularly well, it's not as important of a contribution to the debate. If First Affirmative does an excellent job setting up the debate, and then the rest of the debate becomes a discussion of a weird counter model, I would still probably say that First Affirmative did a good job, because there is no way that they could have preempted that. Whereas if First Affirmative spends their whole speech talking about a bizarrely irrelevant stakeholder or something, even if they do that well, I wouldn't credit that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, cool. Sorry, I had this set up so it's animated. Okay, so how to deliberate then. You've got 15 minutes to discuss your call, which includes deciding the call and deciding speaker scores. So you please make sure that you leave time for speaker scores. Don't call a vote at 15 minutes, call it at 12, so you leave time to decide speaker scores. So you should be at the decision at 12 minutes. The chair should be guiding the discussion, not dominating it, not saying, here's what I think, and you are welcome to agree or disagree. They should be saying like, okay, here's where we're at, here's what we will do, asking specific panelists for their input at different times. The first thing that you should do is you should start by, what time is it? Making sure that I've still got time. You should start by getting everyone's calls, save explaining how they got to those calls until after you've heard them all. So go around and they can say something like, I think affirmative won by a close margin. I think, negative won quite clearly. And then once you've decided that, you can proceed to the actual deliberation. And the chair will indicate how that's the case. If there is a split, you should just try to discuss and resolve it, but make sure that the chair is calling the vote around 12 minutes. If there's a chance that there will be a panelist giving the OA, make sure that you do call the vote at 12 minutes so you can concretize that early and indicate who it's going to be early on so they can prepare. Again, you should have taken the right amount of notes to begin with so that if you are required to give an OA, you're able to. But obviously there's mental kind of preparation that you have to get into. So it shouldn't be like at the 15-minute mark, you go, right, I guess I've been rolled. You're doing the adjudication. And then someone has to suddenly write an OA. So if there is a split, the dissenter should first be given a chance to explain their call and what they saw as the deciding factor in the debate. And then you should be given an opportunity to respond to that and see if you can resolve it. If you can't do that immediately, then the majority should also be discussed by each, and their call should be discussed by each member of the panel. If it's unanimous, you should also go through this process of going around and seeing what everyone thought was the most decisive in the debate. You should raise things like a summary of what you think the most decisive contribution of the winning team was. So you can say, look, I think they won because they proved that they met this, like they proved that we had a principled obligation to do X and that not doing it would have practical harms. You can raise where the obvious clashes, so the ones that organically arose during the debate fell, and why you thought they were on it both sides, you think that they fell the way that they did. Make sure that you're being concise. If you need to elaborate, you will be asked to elaborate, / you can ask people to elaborate, but don't immediately launch into giving like 85 reasons why you think something is true. 12 minutes is not very much time at all. So make sure that you are being concise and then like only discussing things when they need to be discussed. You can also just raise pieces of general feedback for the debate. Things like, I thought this debate was super unclear, super messy. I would have liked to hear like a greater principled discussion or whatever. That should be coming up at that point in time. As you are speaking, everyone else should be taking notes about what you're saying so it can be incorporated into the eventual OA, and also so they can ask you questions on it. How then should we deal with disagreement? Sorry, I just want to double check what time it is. Oh, okay, so I've still got some time. I think this is quite important though. So how do you deal with disagreement? The first thing to note is that disagreement is okay. Some of the, when you look at most out rounds at majors, they have large panels and it is very rare that they unanimously decide a winner, unless of course, your Sydney C at Australs last year. Most of the time, they have some degree of dissent, and these are the best adjudicators at the tournament. It is okay if you don't all come to an agreement. The first thing that you want to do to deal with that disagreement is assess the weight of it. Did you think that it was just a particularly close decision? And it is something that you don't necessarily have to concede, but you can kind of see where the other team is coming from. Or do you think it is something that goes a lot deeper that decides how long you spend discussing this disagreement? The next thing you want to do is identify the area of the disagreement, or like why you are disagreeing in the first place. Maybe you interpreted arguments differently, like you bought a claim or you thought a claim did this and the other adjudicators thought a claim did something else. Maybe you weighed a certain claim more than the other adjudicators did. Maybe you disagree about like a claim being true or being sufficiently proven. Make sure that you are work out exactly what the problem is, because you probably agree on a lot of things. Identify where the difference is, and then try and address it. When you are discussing it, make sure that you are listening to each other and you are giving each other opportunities to speak. But don't just, and I've written here, don't just ping pong, I just thought that. I think that at the point that the adjudication devolves into some person being like, look, I just thought that they did meet their burden, and the other person being like, okay, I just thought that they didn't. And then you just go back and forth over and over. That's obviously not productive. Make sure that you have a chance to say your piece, but don't spend too long kind of just reasserting that you thought that your call was right. Just call a vote and then move on to speaks. So to resolve a disagreement, ask questions to try to better establish where the disagreement has occurred. So you can ask things like, oh, okay, you believe that they said this. When did they say that? Or what did they say the impact of that was? Do you think that they actually sufficiently proved this? To try and prompt your interlocutor to think about it and just maybe, show you their notes to prove where it was. Maybe you missed something. Maybe they missed something. Make sure that you are being polite and impersonal and not attacking them and their quality as a judge, but rather just asking, how did you achieve this read of the debate? A good adjudicator will be open to discussion and willing to have their mind changed sometimes. They don't have to always change their mind, but they should be willing to see a different, or to be convinced that they had the wrong call or missed something important. So do your best to have an earnest and open discussion in good faith. And if maybe you're convinced that you got your call wrong, and that's fine. It's okay to concede that. Bad adjudicators may be quite stubborn and refuse to respond to your prompts. So if you are in a discussion with someone who is just insisting, they're just shutting down and you're saying when did they prove this? And they're they just did. Just be gentle, outline where you think their reasoning falls short. Maybe you don't persuade them, but you might persuade someone else in the room and they may flip their call. You might persuade them, they may not admit that they were wrong, but they might kind of eventually just be you know what, I'll concede it. It can be consensus or whatever. Otherwise, you tried, you did your best. You can go, you go on record as someone who split. You can talk to the teams afterwards and explain it. People won't hold it against you at the end of the day. And remember that this isn't personal. Debates are very subjective. Don't be mad when people disagree with you or roll you. That's counterproductive. They're allowed to do that. Don't feel like a failure if you're in the minority in a call or you disagree with a pro. You're allowed to have different reads of debates than they do. Then how to give an OA. I'll be super quick. Okay, the first thing you want to do is start with general feedback. You should always have this, not only because it's helpful for debaters and everyone needs it, but it also provides context for the call that you're about to give. If both teams struggled with engagement, that is something that's going to become obvious in the discussion of the debate. So make sure that you just flag it at the outset. Then give the call. There's no point holding debaters in suspense. Although if debaters keep if you are the kind of debater who just stops listening once you've heard the call and you don't listen to the justification for it, I'm going to bring back suspense adjing. It is so rude not to listen to an OA. With the reason that we put the call at the start of the OA is for debaters' benefits. So please respect that decision and listen to the actual explanation. Then you want to explain the reasoning. The way that you do that when you're writing the OA is I outline what the main clashes were. That'll hopefully be pretty obvious in the debate. The ones that you want to start with is if there are any arguments or claims or clashes that the rest of the debate was contingent on, those are the first things you want to resolve in your adjudication. Maybe there was a principled clash that you were able to resolve that determined what the metrics for the rest of the debate should be. Maybe there were existential questions about whether something existed or whether it was is this certain does this concept actually exist? Maybe there are issues with characterization about the way that certain people were likely to act. If you can resolve that at the outset of your OA, that explains then how the rest of the debate went. So identify them first. Then you can look at things like practical clashes. They'll probably arise organically in the debate, but things like stakeholders, long versus short-term impacts, and then just explaining how you saw each of them. The way that I do it is you bring up what the affirmative said, then go through and you explain not only what they said, but why the impacts that they outlined and how they proved it, then responses to what the affirmative said, and then you explain what the neg said, and then the responses that came from the affirmative team. Make sure, though, that you're not just recapping the debate, because we all heard the debate. Make sure that you're concluding each clash and each question very clearly, explaining, okay, where's your head at that point in time? Maybe you can say something like, at the end of this, I brought that this principle was important, but it wasn't more important than any practical harms that were going to come out of it. Make sure you're explaining which pieces of which mechanisms you found especially persuasive, which things you discounted, why did that clash matter in deciding the debate? That's, I think, something that a lot of adjudicators fall short in doing, explaining not what was said, but why it contributed to the decision in the way that it did. Yeah?
During the deliberation, that's viewed less favorably, you get penalized and judged for that, you can change your decision.
Whoever told you that was silly. That's absolutely not the case. If you have a good, if you have a call that you can justify, and then you just change it because you are afraid of dissenting, then you can absolutely if, for example, you with a CA and you have a call and you try and explain it and they give you one piece of questioning and then you immediately just concede it, then they can say, look, they didn't defend themselves. I think if you're allowed to concede, obviously you're allowed to concede, it's not a bad thing, but just don't concede because you assume that the other person is correct. Have a discussion, get to a point where you're actually, no, I do see what you mean. I see where you're coming from. I do actually believe that they failed to prove this particular point, or I did miss this particular piece of argumentation. And so I see what you mean. You can outline if you're afraid of that, especially if they're a pro and they are impacting your judge score. You can say things like, you can give the reason why you changed your mind. Instead of just being oh, yep, you're right. You can say, actually, no, I did miss this argument. Therefore, I agree with you. But yeah, don't worry that you look bad if you're not agreeing, if you change your call. It's totally fine. Changing calls is good. Not always good, but it is a fine thing to do. So also at this point, note that if you think that there is anything in the debate that was unimportant or a wash, make sure you explain why. Sometimes I think debaters can just, or adjudicators can just gloss over things. They can either exclude them entirely from the adjudication, or they can say this was unimportant and not explain it. That is not only not particularly clear as to why the debate went the way that it did, but it can also be kind of upsetting or frustrating for adjudicators for debaters if they made a point and then you just kind of dismiss it. Make sure that you're explaining it. In terms of how you set up, how you write your OA, I like to have like a little column for what the affirmative said, a column for what the negative said by like indenting across, having lots of line breaks so that you can just visually see where arguments are. Just make it something that's easy to look at and like digest as you're delivering it. You want to be able to follow along fluidly. And on that note, make sure you do write your OAs. Don't just assume you'll be able to explain things in the moment, because you won't. And then it's really hard to follow as a debater if you lose your place or you don't have examples at hand. So make sure that you are explaining things or you are writing things sufficiently that you're able to deliver them fluidly. And as I flagged earlier, identify areas of disagreement within the panel. You can say things like, note that, the majority bought that this particular characterization was correct, but the minority in the panel thought that, it wasn't proven to sufficiency. You don't have to name the adjudicator that was the dissenter, but just outline. It's like a useful piece of feedback, right? If not everyone bought this particular claim. So how then should you give feedback? Make sure that you are offering it, as I said at the beginning. Make sure when you're writing your notes, make your feedback visually distinct in your notes so it's easy to find. Maybe highlight it. I put mine in bold. Focus on transferable feedback. So these are some examples of pieces of feedback that debaters can take to other debates. I think this is much more valuable in general than case feedback, because case feedback is essentially just what the OA was, right? So if they ask you questions about it or they want a clarification, that's fine, but make sure you've got feedback that they can take to other debates as well. And mention positive things as well. It's really nice, not only just to make people, remind them that they're good debaters, but also so that they can keep doing positive things later on. How then can you improve as an adjudicator? I think this is the last slide. First thing, practice, adjudicate and internals. Tell us now if you want to do an OA. We'll put a pro on the panel with you and they can give you feedback on that OA. Adjudicate high school debates and get paid. Please do that. You all now are very, very qualified. You should do that. Also adjudicate minis. It's usually free for adjudicators. You can get free food and alcohol and endless gratitude from contingents. MAC pre-Easters is coming up this weekend. UNSW pre-Easters is the next weekend. You can just do that, get lots of free food and have fun. Make sure you're listening to the OAs given in debates. Don't just tune out because you think that you will know what the adjudicator is going to say because you're a panelist. And also, if you're a debater, actually listen to the structure of it, not just the decision that they're making. Identify what you do and don't like about them. If someone is very good at OAs, try and mimic the structure that they use or any particular tips that they have. Record your OAs and play them back, which sounds cringe, and it is cringe, but it is a very useful way of identifying what you are good at and what you need to work on. Use the same notes that you had for a debate and do the same OA again and make it better the next time. And if there are any gaps in your notes that made the first OA rocky, fill those gaps in and remember, I need to make sure that I write down the examples I want to refer to in my OA. I promise I'll be done soon. Make sure you ask debaters for feedback. Did that OA explain that decision well? Was it did it make sense? Was there anything that I should do better? Also, make sure that you at minis and at majors give judge feedback and also request not only that people give you judge feedback, but request it from the CAs at the end of the tournament that you get it. I think we need to do a lot more to actually get judges feedback. At the moment, you can do a whole tournament and just never get any feedback on how good you were. And then obviously no one's going to improve. So make sure that you are giving and requesting feedback. Ask me any questions now. For the young people who don't have Facebook, I put my Instagram up there, but I prefer Messenger. Please, contact me if you have any questions and judge well. Sorry that was a bit long, but hopefully it was fine. How do I?
Hey everyone, for anyone